We've started running through a session of Moses and the children of Israel as they left Egypt. When we read the books, the first 5 books, they're our history. We can relate those to ourselves, even though it happened all that time in the past, and even though Jesus wasn't there in person, we can still relate that to ourselves as we go, just like the Israelites did, from excitement in God to falling away from God, to grumbling of God and yet sometimes praising him. And so we're going to be running through a few chapters. I'm not going to be reading them all. We're running a bit of shorter time, but I won't anyway. We're looking really at chapter 32 of Exodus. Now, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god, or make us gods, who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Now, here he's talking about being up the mountain. Well, if we go back to the beginning of this, if we remember that Moses had led the people out of Egypt, the people of Israel had seen many signs and wonders, but we must remember that they had been in Egypt as captives, well, not for the whole period, but they'd been in Egypt for 400 years and captive for many years. They had come across all the things that Egypt offers, all the gods, all the luxuries, all those sort of things they had come across, and it was a great pull on them. We saw Pharaoh, who was represented as a god. We saw various other things, objects of worship, all represented as different gods, as there were different gods in that time in Egypt. And very much as there are in the world today. We might not sort of see them as gods or name them as gods, but they're there drawing us away. Things that we worship. Our cars, our children, our pets, there's so many things on the television, the entertainment world, all of those things are there to draw us. And God led them through. He opened the Sea of Reeds for them to cross over, and they all crossed over, and then he brought the sea down upon the Egyptians as they followed him. And all of this before them. And then right before them, as they crossed that sea, they're up in the mountains. There was this great temple, the Baal Zephon temple. It was a ziggurat where people used to go and worship, set up high. They'd have been used to that, because they'd have been used to worshipping Baal as part of everything else within Egypt. But there they were. They saw this there. And yet God opened the sea for them and led them across. Here was a difference between what Baal could do and what God could do. And as he led them through the wilderness to the Mount Sinai. But even during that period, and even though all those miracles that they had seen, they grumbled and moaned all the time. And eventually they ended up at Mount Sinai. And then if you look at chapter 19 of Exodus, it's an amazing chapter. I'm going to go fairly quickly through all of these things, but it's worthwhile you going back and reading over some of the things, some of the chapters that I've spoken about. In chapter 19, it says, "In the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Mount Sinai, and we saw Moses going up to meet God. And the whole people were aware of God coming down on this mountain. There was fire, there were lightning, there were trumpet sounds, and they looked up and they saw this God on top of this mountain. They'd never come across anything like it before, but there they were facing this fire and smoke and all these sounds and things. No wonder they were terrified. I'm sure all we would have been terrified. And Moses came down again and he says, look, in verse 5, "If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God was setting them clearly aside from everybody else. The people answered and said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." But they said, "We don't want to go up that mountain or know anything about this. Moses, you go up on our behalf." They didn't want to face the reality of God themselves because inside them they couldn't. So Moses became their spokesman. And as we go through this passage, we can turn to now to chapter 32. So Moses had gone up on the mountain again. And this time, God was going to give him the covenant and various other things. If we go to chapter 24, we see God saying to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and you shall worship at a distance. Moses alone, however, shall come near to the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people come up with him." So then Moses came and recounted the words to the people, all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered in one voice again, "All the words which the Lord has spoken we will do." This wasn't the first time. They keep saying, "Yeah, all the words we will do." So Moses then was commanded to go up to the mountain again. And if we look at verse 12, "Now the Lord said to Moses, 'Come up to me on the mountain and remain there, and I will give you the stone tablets with the law and the commandment which I have written for their instruction.' So Moses arose with Joshua his servant, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. But to the elders he said, 'Wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a legal matter, let him approach them.' Then Moses went up to the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. And the glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And on the 7th day he called to Moses from the midst of the cloud. And to the eyes of the sons of Israel, the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. And Moses entered the midst of the cloud as he went up to the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So can you imagine? There was all of this smoke and all that was there. And then the people actually see Moses go and walk into it. Then they could no longer see him. It's like that, those dense fogs that we used to get. They're there and nobody can see him. He's gone. Well, now we come to chapter 32. So when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down, now how long had he been gone? 40 days and 40 nights, that's an awful long time. They said, "Cool, what's happened to this guy?" Well, I'm sure we would think likewise. I mean, you read that and it's quite reasonable for the people to say, "Look, we saw him go into this cloud and he's not come out. Where is he? He could be dead for all we know. And here we are, we're just stuck here. What do we do?" Now, you've got to remember that Israel had been used to following things. They'd been used to following gods in Egypt. And when Moses, and also Pharaoh as a god in Egypt. And then when Moses came along, they were used to following this guy. And suddenly there was nobody there for them. Nobody to lead them. They needed somebody there. They didn't want to know God themselves. They'd already said to God, "No, we're not going to come out the mountain. That's too scary. We're not going to come up." Moses goes up, but now he'd gone. "What am I going to do?" they would have been saying. "What are we going to do? We're lost." So it was quite reasonable. They've all gone. What are we going to do? Well, what did we used to have? Well, we used to worship gods in Egypt, didn't we? And we used to have those, and we used to have those leaders. Why not come and make another god? All right, Moses, we don't know what's happened to him. Let's make a god. So they made this golden calf. "Come," they said, "make us gods who will go before us, because this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron said, "Okay, get all your people to tear off their rings and their earrings and that, and we'll see what we can do." So they tore them off, and it says in verse 4, "And he took from their hand and fashioned it with a graven tool and made it into a molten calf." So there they go and produce this molten calf, and there it is. And then they said, the people said, note that not Aaron said, the people said, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." Well, they knew it wasn't, but it was their representation because they were used to those sort of things. Moses had disappeared, and now they'd made this thing, and there was Aaron before them. And what was he must have been thinking? I thought, well, I mustn't do this. You know, we're not allowed to worship idols. We've come out. We're separated from the world. What am I going to do? Yeah, I've got all these people before me. They'll stone me. They'll kill me. They'll do anything to me. They've got this idol before them. So he says, in verse 5, now he saw this and he thought, well, they were proclaiming his God. So I know what we'll do. We'll proclaim it a feast to the Lord. And we'll just make use of this idol. But we'll make it a feast to the Lord, because it's the Lord that brought us out. So he was trying to get around this idol that he had made and give an excuse for worshipping it. So the next day they rose early and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. Now, they'd been used to all of this sort of thing, all of this sort of behaviour in worshipping the God in Egypt. They rose up to play. Now, to play is more than just to play. It's worshipping before the God and partaking in all the rituals related to that God, sexual and otherwise. But they couldn't escape God. He knows what's happening. And he knew what was happening. And Moses was up there with him. So he sent Moses down. And he said, look, the people have turned aside. Amazing, as we read through this chapter, he said, look, this people, they're no good. They've turned aside. Let me wipe them out. And I will then make you, Moses, the people that's going to follow me. Now that's quite enticing, isn't it, for a leader? I'm going to say, you're the guy that I'm really choosing. Imagine God saying, you're the guy, you're the one. I'm going to make something of you. It's easy to go to ourselves and our pride and think, oh yes, God's going to make me special. But what does Moses do? He says, no, Lord, look, let me remind you of what happened. You pulled all these people out of Egypt, not me. You took them out, and the nations saw you take them out. What are the nations going to say? They're going to say, you took them out of Egypt to wipe them out. He said, do you think that's good? God, do you think that's good? Can you imagine Moses speaking to God in that sort of way? Do you think that's a good idea? So Moses said, no, all right, we won't do that. You go down and sort the people out. When they got down, they found that they were carrying on and doing all sorts of things, singing in the camp and doing all sorts of things. There's nothing wrong with the singing, but it's what they were doing that was wrong. And Moses was angry. Now, if we pick it up at verse 15, then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets which were written on both sides. They were written on one side and the other. And the tablets were God's work, and the writing was God's writing engraved on the tablets. Verse 19, and it came about as soon as Moses came near the camp that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger burned, and he threw the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. And he said in verse 21, Moses said to Aaron, what did the people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them? And Aaron said, do not let the anger of my Lord burn. You know the people yourself, that they are prone to evil. For they said to me, make a God for us who will go before us. For this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And I said to them, whoever has any gold, let them tear it off. So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came a calf. Now, can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? What a thing to say. Aaron, I've got this gold, I threw it into the fire, and a calf came out. Can you imagine anything as silly as that? But that's what he said. How often we make up these silly excuses for our misdeeds. So when Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control, he picks it up in verse 25, to be a derision among the enemies. You know, God is to be glorified, not to be made to look stupid, and this is what they were doing. The nations would have derided God with all of these things that had happened. You know, when we commit these sins, when we commit such stupid works, it's God we're affecting, and also the nations or the people around us, because they see those things and say, oh, I thought you were a Christian. Why are you doing that then? And those things have an effect. And then later on, we'll miss that bit out for the moment because we're running short of time. We find that Moses ground up this calf that they had made and put it in the water and made them drink it. They had drunk something of what they had made. There were a number of people that died that day, and later he brought a plague on them. For us today, as we've gone through in the Hebrews reading, Christ is here. We can approach Christ, we can approach God the Father directly through Christ. This is something so different for these people. God was leading them through that promised land. He wanted them desperately to know him as Lord, but they failed him. They were supposed to be a kingdom of priests. Do you know what a priest is? A priest is someone that acts on behalf of others, that others might know God. To stand in that way, but they had failed. And throughout the history of Israel, we see them failing completely, and yet they're God's people. But he never gave up on them. And right from the beginning, he promised that Christ would come. Christ would come. And he would be the perfect person. He would live on this earth, go through a lot of suffering, and yet he would not sin. And through his death and resurrection, we can approach God. We haven't got to worry about that big fire on the mountain. We know God is all-powerful, almighty. He's something greater than we can possibly imagine. But through Christ, and Christ alone, nobody else, through Christ alone, we have access to God. We have access to God. So in that, as we come and we live through this life, and we're going to make mistakes, we're going to do things wrong, there's no doubt about that. But we have Christ. And when we find ourselves in difficult situations, maybe we're tempted to do this or do that, whatever. But let's call upon Christ before we fall down that hole of temptation and bring him and the church into disrepute. If one sins, that affects the church. I don't mean necessarily this church, although it does, but it affects the whole church at large, because people will be looking on and saying, yeah, you're supposed to be better than me, a Christian and all that sort of thing, and now you've done this. So, the golden calves in our lives, let us grind them up and throw them away. Not drink them, but just throw them away. Let us have nothing to do with our golden calves. And let us come to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our salvation. Thank you, Lord.